everyone, and thank you all for joining us for the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion Symposium, Indigenous Knowledge, Science, and Ethical Frameworks for Collaboration. I will share my screen with you here in a second here, if I may. So once again, thank you all for being here at the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion Symposium on Indigenous Knowledge, Science, and Ethical Frameworks for Collaboration. First, I'd like to thank you all for being here with us and talk a little bit about the DOZA program. My name is Curtis Baxter, and I am a Senior Program Associate at AAAS in the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion program, also known as DOZER. And I am one of the organizers of this symposium, along with my colleague, Dr. Rob O'Malley. I'll be your moderator for this session. We are able, through this virtual platform, we're able to gather together across the country and the world. I want to gratefully thank all the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we stand on today, as well as the vibrant and diverse Native peoples who make their home on those lands today as well. So thank you. Before diving into today's session, I'd like to talk a little bit about DOZER and as well as some of the programs and projects that we do there at DOZER, and then move on into our session today. Usually we have 90 minutes, today we have 45, so I'll keep it very brief. So DOZER was established over 25 years ago. This year will be 26th anniversary, and we're planning to have our, we would have had our 25th anniversary event last year, but we held it to this year. So be on the lookout for that. It's going to be in June, early June. So be on the lookout for that date as well. DOZER is one of 8 programs in AAAS's Office of Science Policy Society programs. We build upon AAAS's longstanding commitment to relate scientific knowledge and technological developments to the concerns, purposes, and interests of society at large. We do this through a variety of projects and programs at DOZER. At AAAS meetings in the past, we hosted a number of symposia, as well as workshops on various topics such as gene editing and its ethical implications, the role of religious leaders in the Paris Climate Agreement, as well as the biology of resilience. These have been recorded and can be seen on our DOZER website. We also have we also host a number of public lectures at AAAS HQ in DC. One of the ones that's our annual holiday lecture, we have a number of topics. Last year, as you can see in the bottom right there, or bottom left, however you're looking at it, is the imagining different worlds, science, ethics, and faith. And that was on science fiction, which was quite fascinating, very well attended, and as we recorded as well, it can be found on our website as well. We had other topics in regards to neuroscience and morality, public health and identity, and artificial intelligence and the like. So those have been recorded as well. It can be found on our DOZER website. Another way we fulfill our objective in regards to facilitating conversations and providing opportunities for engagement between scientific and religious communities is through a variety of projects and collaborations as well. The first one is Science with Seminaries, the one I co-manage with a DOZER colleague. And the aim of that project is to equip future religious leaders who are going through theological education in seminary or divinity school with basic scientific knowledge and science resources to be able to engage in conversations with their future congregants on topics of science and ethical and technology topics and issues. We do this by providing the seminary faculty with pedagogical toolkits, science resources, and connections to local scientists, so they are able to integrate forefront science into their course curriculum. So far, we worked with 34 seminaries, and over 110 courses have been integrated with science at over 100 campus science-themed campus-wide events has been held. One of the crown jewels of that project is the Science to Wide Angle resources, which is a brief video series of a number of videos, which focus on a lot of different topics: neuroscience and morality, astronomy, cosmology, biological evolution, and other topics. A more recent series we started is Humans and Race, which our first video, which came out within the past month, focuses on the topic "Race is not biological." And so that, as the title suggests, is a conversation about how the misperception of race being biologically based. So please check those out at our sciencereligiondialogue.org website. You're able to download those as well. Another project is the Engaging Scientists Project, Engaging Scientists in Science and Religion Dialogue. And that's where we work with scientists who want to communicate their science to religious publics. Do this through a variety of workshops and such, and a number of resources. One of the great resources is the profiles of a variety of scientists from a number of backgrounds who talk about how they engage, as well as best practices in regards to science engagement as well. Those are collaborations. So we have a project with Zooniverse, which essentially is opening up scientific research to the public, and particularly religious communities, so they can have a stake in scientific research. Another one is Scientists in Synagogues, where we bring forefront science with to Jewish congregations. And the last is Equipping Christian Leaders in an Age of Science, AAAS as they call it. And that's essentially a model of the Science Seminars Project, but based in UK. We're working with some colleagues from Durham University over there, across the pond there. And as for resources, we have a number of resources, videos, articles, and more, and a number of booklets about our projects. And those can be found on sciencereligiondialogue.org. Lastly, stay connected with us. You can visit us at AAAS.org/Dozer. You'll see a number of projects there, and a number of information and such there, as well as and other social media pieces there as well. We also have a number of events that are, beside this one today, the Indigenous Knowledge session. We also have a number of other sessions and events as well. You have the second one, the Science Communication and Engagement with Religious Publics Workshop. I think that's full right now, but that's essentially part of the Engaging Scientists Workshop. You might check to see if there's a spot there, but I don't think so. Usually if we're in person, we were together in Arizona, we'd have a Dozer reception. And in place of that, we have the no wine, no cheese, no problem. Science and faith networking session, networking social, excuse me. And that's tomorrow, starting at 5 o'clock. And then on Wednesday, we have the Dynamic Pass, how science helps give voice to silence stories. And that's a session which is on Wednesday, showing how science can bring, uncovering some of the silent stories of marginalized communities. And lastly, we have Pursuing Environmental Justice in Science and Religion workshop. And that's a workshop that's focused on environmental justice and climate change. Please look at the annual meeting webpage for the Dynamic Pass videos and see what you get a taste of what also Dozer does as well. So thank you all again, and welcome to the Indigenous Knowledge, Science, and Ethics Frameworks for Collaboration. I hope everyone, before you came on, you're able to see some of the spotlight pre-recorded videos from my speakers. So just to give you a layout of how we're gonna do this today. If you haven't, don't worry about it. I'm gonna invite each one of our speakers in turn to introduce themselves, as well as give a brief synopsis of the presentation, just to refresh your memories as well, and just to share what they presented on in their spotlight videos, as well as I responded as well. And Lee will talk a little bit about the connecting points between all of these, as well as some of the high points and highlight some of the things he thinks are important that came out from these presentations. So the purpose of this symposium is to highlight and show the diversity and how what the wealth and impact that diverse voices bring to the conversation of scientific research in here. And so without further ado, I will not hold up too long. We don't have a lot of time, and I want to start off with some conversation. But first, let's start. I will stop sharing my screen here. And I know everybody is chomping at the bit to hear from our presenters and our scientists here. So being the Southern gentleman I am, I'll start with ladies first and start with Crystal Sosi.
Yat Evana, Crystal Sosi. Good morning and Dinepazad. Thank you so much for having me this morning, at least in Mountain Time. When we think about the standard of informed consent, it is highly centered in a Western point of view that centers the individual's determination of risks and benefits. But let's think about this for a moment. When these standards, be it through the Belmont Report or other ethical frameworks, were established, we were considering biological samples that were limited in re-identification risks. Now, when we think about DNA that not only re-identifies us, but also everyone that we are biologically related to, we really must reconsider these guidelines. We're not just talking about individual risks and benefits, but also group risk, something that is more consistent with Indigenous communitarian ethics. The takeaway? If people are not informed about group risk when talking about genomic data, is it truly informed consent? Are we failing study participants by not considering risk beyond just the individual? When talking about underrepresented groups, are we just furthering the ethical imbalance by centering only a Western construct, which is culturally incongruent for how Indigenous peoples have always governed themselves? Thank you, and I hope you watch my video.
Thank you, Crystal. Now I'd like to ask Nanaba Garrison to please.
Hi, good morning. It's also morning time where I am. Yat Ayabinit, that's hello in Navajo language. My name is Nanaba Garrison, and I'm an associate professor at UCLA with a background in genetics and ethics. And I'm from the Navajo tribe in Arizona. My presentation was really focused on thinking about frameworks for engaging Indigenous peoples in genomic research. We have a long history of research that has not really worked out very well for Indigenous peoples and for a lot of different underrepresented minority groups. And so one of the things that our group, or that I have been involved in over the past couple of years, along with both Olufox and Crystal Sosi on this call, is thinking about how to engage Indigenous peoples in genomics. Almost 10 years ago, we formed an organization called the Summer Internship for Indigenous Peoples in Genomics, or SING for short. And through the SING program, we actually came up with a couple of different ways of engaging people or thinking about frameworks for bringing all different types of components together to think about ways to engage communities, think about tribal sovereignty. If there is tribal sovereignty, that must be considered when engaging communities in research. And we've also woven in some concepts from bioethics and from the Belmont Report and other ideas to think about respect for persons and reciprocity and equity and justice, to really think about ways to enhance genetic research. We also are really interested in capacity building, so trying to help people to learn different types of skills to be able to conduct research on their own, transparency, being transparent about the research process, and also thinking about effective communication to communities so that science is communicated in an appropriate way. So those are some of the things that we've been involved in. I've also been involved in developing or working with tribal communities to develop policies that will help tribes to have stronger policies in place if they wish to engage in research. And I really hope that you've also been able to watch my video, or if not, feel free to take a look at that afterwards. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Nanaba. And next we have Olufox.
All right. Aloha. My name is Olufox, and I am an assistant professor here at the University of California, San Diego, located here in Kumeyaay Nation. And I'm originally from the Big Island of Hawaii, in Niuli'iahupua'a. And I've been a tool maker since a little kid. And that's what I do today. I make a lot of different tools for genomic technologies. I received my PhD in genome sciences. And I focused a lot on designing technologies that enable kind of technological independence and democratizing a lot of genomic-based tools. Recently, though, I've just started the Indigenous Futures Lab, which is a part of our design lab here. And we work collaboratively on a number of different projects. So we're thinking about emerging technologies like genome sequencing or genome editing, and the value of an Indigenous mindset in the way that we use these tools to empower our communities in many, many, many different ways. And I've been doing that with these two mana wahine, these incredible Dene women. And we have been working on this for some time and thinking about it in many novel ways in the way that we apply these new technologies. And that's exactly what I talked about in the talk that I gave. Mostly though, I focused on this emerging market in the way that DNA that's collected from Indigenous people is beginning to be commoditized. And how do we create deterrent technologies, safeguarding technologies as a means to avoid that and or utilize those, financial aspects of it so that it can actually impact our communities in a positive way. So thank you. Hope you listen to my video.
Thank you, Keolu. And last, we have our respondent who put all this together and who really commented on a lot and did a fantastic job, Lee Bitsoy.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Curtis, Ahihat Crystal, Ahihat Nanaba, and Aloha Keolu. It's great to be here today to share some insights with you. And what really resonates with me with these emerging scholars and the work that they're doing, having an impact on Indigenous communities, is the pro-Indigenous framework that they approach this work in, and really how their indigeneity informs their scholarships. And I think it's important to note that what they're advocating for is really about treating research participants as equal partners and really emphasizing the importance of how we can really utilize the information that is out there within Indigenous communities. And that's what they're highlighting here today. And that's what inspires me. And in my background as a bioethicist, I think it's important to be able to empower communities as equal partners in any sort of scientific research. And my background is interdisciplinary, and I currently serve as the Associate Vice President for Diversity Affairs at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado, which is a Native American serving institution, where over 45% of our student population is Indigenous. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. And so I have a couple questions here to start us off with, and then we'll answer those questions and have a conversation amongst ourselves. And then maybe about 5 or 10 minutes or so into this, we'll open up to the Q&A from the audience as well, which you can put them in the chat or I think you can submit them as well. And so we got 2 of us here. My colleague, Rob O'Malley, is here with me, so we'll be able to send those my way. My first question I can ask, and anyone can answer this as well. I think I try to make these as equitable to everybody's presentations as well. It says, can you expand a bit more, a bit on models for ethical and inclusive practices, inclusive practice around genetics and health and health with Indigenous communities that research labs and institutions can learn from? So essentially, what are some models out there in regards to engagement with Indigenous communities that labs and institutions can learn from that aren't common practice right now?
I'd be happy to start.
Oh, thank you.
So in my presentation, I actually get into a little bit more detail about a paper that we published back in 2016 that is actually open access, so anybody can access that paper. The first author was Katrina Claw, and it was published in Nature Communications. We described what we call a framework for enhancing Indigenous participation in genetics. And we thought about multiple different components that a researcher should consider if they want to engage in research with Indigenous peoples. But we also learned after we published this paper that it can be applied to other populations as well, not just Indigenous peoples and not just people who have tribal sovereignty that I'll describe very briefly. But these different components can be applied to multiple different communities. But for example, we actually we thought about making sure that researchers understand tribal sovereignty. So what that means is many different tribes in the US have different laws in place that people would have to follow if they want to engage in research with the tribe. Some tribes have their own IRBs or institutional review boards that review research. They have their own human subjects research boards, and they have their own ways of regulating research. Not all tribes have this, and not all tribes have federal sovereign recognition, which would promote some of the laws, but this is something that many different communities have, or they have some sort of oversight structure in place that a researcher should be very aware of and be able to work with the system. We also really promote community engagement, so that people who want to conduct a research study with a community really should become engaged with the community from the very beginning, rather than coming back to them at the end or coming to them and say, hey, I have an idea. What we would like to see is when a researcher has an idea, rather than writing up a research grant and coming up with a whole research protocol and then coming to the community, we want to see them come to the community before doing all of that legwork. And so that the community is there from the very beginning and saying, I really like your research ideas, but why don't we also incorporate something else that is of interest to our community into this research project? Or they might say, actually, we're not interested in that project, but we have these other interests or other health priorities that we would be very interested in. Let's work together. And so we want to see more of that collaboration happening from the very beginning of a research project. And I think from that really stems the rest of our framework, which is to incorporate cultural competencies so that people can understand the culture of both in both directions. So not only should researchers understand the culture of the people that they're working with, the people that are coming from the community should also have the opportunity to learn about the culture of scientists, so that scientists should be transparent in sharing how we do research. For example, the culture of researchers has often been to share research data with each other. Sometimes the community might not understand that, so researchers have to have a better job at being transparent. And I think Dr. Fox can talk to that quite a bit more. We also have incorporated capacity building. I mentioned that very briefly earlier, so that this is an opportunity to train community members so that they can actually go out and help collect the data or help recruit people or help to synthesize the data and analyze the data with the researchers, and to also provide some context so that when the research results are being interpreted, we have that context built into it. And then I think that communities also should be engaged in the dissemination of findings so that it's done in a way that is culturally respectful and that the language can come down to a level that the community can understand, or reinterpret it in a language that the community can understand. So those are sort of the ideas that came into our framework, and I think the other two can expand on them in a bit more detail too.
Thank you, Nanaba. Keolu or Crystal?
Kelly, you want to go first and address benefit sharing? Because I'm going to go more in a direction of tribal data sovereignty.
Sure. Yeah, we work together, man. So, okay, well, just in terms of just to piggyback on what Dr. Professor Garrison was saying, some of the kind of issues here are what happens with the data and how it's shared and what types of kind of transparency there is around that. So there are kind of some really cool new methods and technologies that allow us to create kind of record keeping systems, like a ledger system of who has touched data, when, where, timestamps, etc. And this is really valuable because you can see who's accessing what. And if you allow for a certain level of community designed control, then you can actually have the community determine who gets access to what, when, where, and why. And I think one of the main reasons for this is because communities are really tired of having their genomes traded around like baseball cards from one institution to another without fully understanding what's being done with it. This creates and allows for a whole new level of transparency. And we've seen things like blockchain being used in financial sectors to deter money laundering, for example. So there are a lot of parallels with treating data as a resource, which it is, the #1 resource, surpassing oil in 2018. Say it with me. And so that means that if it is going to be commodified, which it has been and will continue to, and as we see genomic technologies emerge to create things like mRNA vaccines, which are very, very relevant right now, we are going to we need to see our communities get a cut of the potential profits and proceeds from this. And that alludes to what Crystal was saying about benefit sharing. What opportunities exist? When 23andMe goes public, like they did last week, why wouldn't it be relevant or ethical for the people who contributed, they graciously contributed their genomes to enable them to go public and become a multi-billion-dollar company? Why wouldn't they get a cut or percentage of the proceeds or be awarded equity in the company? So I hope the 23andMe folks are listening, because that's the future. More sustainable, culturally sustainable, sharing, benefit sharing, share your money. And that's what we're advocating for.
Thank you, Keola.
So one of the things that I'm really excited to talk about are models of data governance. And when you do a literature search on models of data governance, we really don't find anything beyond philosophical, thoughts about how data should be governed, but there really hasn't been a clear consensus or a concise framework that's ever been published related to Indigenous peoples. Of course, there's more conversation about that recently. But when we talk about frameworks of data governance, really these frameworks should start with who owns or who had stewardship over the data, as Dr. Fox was stating. And if we look at the history of data governance in Indigenous communities, we really see it along a spectrum. We see it on one end of the spectrum where tribes have just disengaged in research and they just actively choose not to participate in research. And that has been something that we've seen consistently recently as well as historically. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have a yet to be realized theoretical model of tribally driven research. And TDR is something that was coined by Dr. Eddie Brown at Arizona State University in the 90s and early 2000s. And we still haven't seen a true representation of what tribally driven research looks like, in which the tribe has complete ownership or stewardship, in which the tribe retains control and responsibility over all aspects of data, including like who collects it, stores it, and also uses it. What we've seen most frequently is something that we call a tribal trust relationship, in which the tribe has no or little ownership or stewardship, in which an outside entity, who's usually non-tribal, makes the decisions on behalf of the tribe on relating to how that data is collected and stored. And whether or not that non-tribal entity truly has the benefits of the Indigenous peoples centered or at heart is always a question. So I'm really honored and pleased to be part of this growing numbers of Indigenous genomicists and scientists and academics who are really talking about working with communities to create Indigenous biodata repositories. And we see this worldwide in the other international Indigenous communities. We've seen this in in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We've seen this in Australia. We are seeing models in British Columbia for the First Nations. And then it's really my honor to be a part of the Native Biodata Consortium, which is, Kiela's really, singing our praises right now, but it's one of the first truly indigenous-led biological data repositories in the US, and that our board members comprise of tribal community members and indigenous scientists. And this is really something that we call a tribal partnership, in which a third party, but a native-owned entity, is actually working with the community to co-develop data policies and data sharing and data governance policies with indigenous communities in the US, so that we can serve as an alternative to federally run biorepositories, so that tribes actually have a greater means of exercising and asserting control over what happens to the samples and data. As Kiela mentions over and over again, we're really talking about a data economy. So we're not just talking about what happens to the samples anymore, but also what's happening to the data. And we really need to center and recenter those questions and data decisions back to community members. So this is something we're really excited to be a part of. And this is something that Dr. Garrison also talks about, is, this movement of indigenous data sovereignties, and also what we hope to see as indigenous genomic data sovereignties, where we're talking about recentering DNA back to tribal community members.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Crystal. And this question might be in line with that as well, in regards to data sovereignty and the ethical framework. And what role, if any, do journals that publish research utilizing Native American DNA have in enforcing ethical frameworks of working with these groups? And I'll toss that up for anyone who wants to take would like to answer that one.
I'm muted like my grandpa. Okay, so check it out. They have a huge responsibility in shaping the trajectory of not only the science that investigators create, but also what the ethical standard is. And this goes in a number of directions. I'll just focus on ancient DNA for a moment, because a lot of it is being derived from our communities, and I don't think it's being derived with proper consent at all. And a lot of these investigators, like David Reich, for example, at Harvard University, name them, are violating a lot of human rights over time. And this is highly problematic, because it's not just Native communities in Polynesia, Micronesia, Turtle Island. It's all over the world where these types of human rights violations are happening. And these types of journals need to engage and understand that they're enabling this. They're enabling this by allowing them to publish there. So AAAS, for example, in Science Magazine, has a huge responsibility and culpability in preventing these types of things from happening, and understanding that there must be a higher ethical standard when the ethical bar is so low that you need a shovel. So I just wanted to put that out there, and I'd be curious what everyone else has to say, but I think we're starting to get frustrated. So
thank you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I don't mind, sorry if I hop in with that. Journals have an ethical standard. It's just a matter of time where we start pressuring journals to actually consider these questions about where did the data come from, where did this, and who has access to it, and really calling into question not only to the researchers, but also the journals that are giving platform to the researchers, to really stop this extraction of data coming from our communities. And Dr. Fox is right in highlighting that a huge portion of these issues come from paleogenomics and ancient DNA research. But as the three of us were co-authors on a paper that came out just last summer that really talks about how this boundary between what constitutes samples and data derived from ancient indigenous populations and what the samples and data arriving coming from like living descendants, that boundary is becoming increasingly blurred in genomics. And I put the link right there. It's called Generations of Genomes. And if anyone wants to have access to it, just please email any one of us. But we're really talking about how this line between what constitutes our ancestors versus our descendants is just becoming blurred as we're talking more about how health genomics is moving forward, how, you know, our ability to interrogate genomes from outside what constitutes human subjects research just by simply sequencing environmental soil microbes that are occurring around, you know, our ancestral remains, you know, as a means for deriving human DNA. Like there are ways of circumventing indigenous community consents by going outside of the US, for instance, and talking about procuring genomes from indigenous communities who don't have the same federal or outside governance that recognizing their means of sovereignty. This type of extraction occurs largely outside the US that we see, but we're also talking about looking at not just, you know, individuals that have the current ability to consent to this, but also talking about going outside of our descendants to our ancestors. And for indigenous peoples, that's a huge concern because we don't see these same lines, you know, that distinguishes our descendants from our current living relatives. To us, we're all the same, and we all need to be respected in terms of how we're collecting this information.
Thank you, Crystal.
I'd like to jump in real quick and just add on to what's being shared. And in terms of access and equity, a lot of the journals, these established journals, if you will, that are prestigious, really cater toward a white heteronormative perspective in research. And a lot of voices of color, scientists of color, researchers of color are often not given that same sort of access. And so therefore, again, this goes back to the pro-Indigenous approach that we would like to see expanded, not only in genomic and genetic research, but other disciplines as well, so that there's more representation from our perspectives rather than the usual scientific community that will impose their findings onto communities. So we need to have more of an empowerment.
If I may just jump in as well, really quickly, this whole discussion is awesome. And I really want to see something come from it. If there are any journal editors watching, I think what would be really amazing and could really help the field is if there can be an opportunity to collaborate on such a piece that will provide guidance. If there are any journal editors that would like to commission members of our group, and we have a whole network of other Indigenous scholars, maybe we can enter into conversation and really think about how to put together some guidance for people who are working in these areas. Because there are lots of questions. I get questions all the time. Is this appropriate or not? Is there a checklist that I should follow? Are there standards that I should think about? So it would be really amazing to see something like that come out of this. Thanks.
And I would even add on to that, Nanaba, thank you, Professor Garrison, is that Curtis and Rob, I challenge the AAAS to convene such a meeting and an opportunity for us to contribute on our terms. And I think that would be great. So that's my challenge to you.
Thank you, Lee. We always like a challenge. We'll see how that, we'll try our best. We have roughly about 2 minutes to go. And I would like two things if possible within these, or actually 2 minutes. Any resources that people that you think would be useful, as well as any lasting thoughts, any last thoughts you want people to take away from this. We've had a great conversation, and just please, those two things, resources and lasting thoughts that you want people to take away from this conversation. In 30-second bites, if possible.
Well, we are putting some links to publications that are available in the chat, so feel free. I think this is only the beginning of a larger discussion that we should be having. I think one of the other things I want to just share really quickly is that there are much more Indigenous peoples coming into the scientific space and earning PhDs and master's degrees and different types of doctoral degrees. So this is a really exciting time to have these conversations, and I really thank AAAS for the opportunity for us to share these discussions with you right now.
I don't know where our other participant left, but I really, again, want to echo thanks for AAAS for highlighting our voices in this space. And I do also want to suggest to all of our non-Indigenous peoples, we want to caution our allies that allyship is not self-defined. It is defined by the communities that you work with. And Indigenous scientists, as emerging as we are, we're unfortunately always going to be outnumbered. And we rely on ethical non-Indigenous allies to work with us. And working with us is key. Because what I've been seeing, unfortunately, is that Indigenous data sovereignties is one of the hot topics, especially considering last year's movements for racial equity. And I want to state that unless you're working with Indigenous scientists and communities and academics, if you're just taking those knowledges away from us to publish on your own and procure grants on your own, then that is a form of extraction as well. And that not just talking about extracting our genomes for commodification purposes, as Dr. Fox mentioned, but there's also extraction of our knowledges. So we really want to stress and highlight the importance of working with us in a collaborative and cooperative format.
The last comment I will make in terms of allies, not only do we need allies, but we need accomplices.
Well, again, thank you all. And as you said, hopefully we can grow from this conversation and continue this conversation. I want to thank you, Kiulu, as well as Lee Bitsoy, as well as Nanaba Garrison and Crystal Sosi. And y'all have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.